Nicknamed the Great Gray Green Greasy, the Limpopo River is one of Africa's largest rivers. It serves as a border between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and it also happens to be one of the most dangerous places on Earth. A town in South Africa called Phalaborwa sits on Limpopo's shores, and all of its residents know they're never supposed to step foot inside of the dangerous waterway. But not all of their residents take that guidance seriously. On January 1st, 2010, Phalaborwa resident Mariska Buitendog, along with her boyfriend and 6 of their other friends, had been out all night partying, celebrating the new year. They had had a considerable amount of alcohol over the course of the night, so as the sun was coming up, in their inebriated state, they decided they wanted to take an early morning dip in the Limpopo River. So they head over to the river, and while initially they all seemed really eager to get in the waterway, it was only Mariska that was brave enough to do it. So the rest stayed on shore, and Mariska jumped in the river and jumped right out again. And she survived, and everyone was very impressed with her. And so she's confident, and so she does it again, this time going a little bit farther out into the river before coming back on shore. Now she's really confident, she's done it twice, and so she said, "Hey, who wants to come with me for a third time in?" And the group said, "No, we're still good, and you really shouldn't push your luck. This is not safe." And she said, "I don't care, I'm going in for a third time." So Mariska gets in the water, and by herself, she swims out on her back about 15 meters away from shore. She turns and waves at the group and smiles before she is violently pulled under the water. There wasn't even time for her to scream. Her boyfriend immediately jumped into the water to try to pull her out, but he knew where she was, and there was no way he was getting her back. The other nickname for the Limpopo River is Crocodile River, and Mariska, unfortunately, had fell victim to one of its apex predators. But it's not just drunk partygoers that fall victim to these crocodiles. Unfortunately for the residents of Zimbabwe, because of the extreme hardships they have to face, many of them have been forced to flee the country and cross over the Limpopo River to try to gain entry into South Africa, and many of them will die trying. On April 11th, 2014, Zimbabwean and South African police discovered this crocodile-infested cave right near where Zimbabwean residents will try to cross over the Limpopo River, and inside of this cave were the remains of 15 people that presumably tried to cross over and were caught by crocodiles. The discovery of this cave and the 15 people who lost their lives inside of it, while tragic and certainly gruesome, it only represents a fraction of the total number of people who have died trying to cross this river. The next story, which is our number 2 story on today's list, is called No Way Out. In 1986, 35 million Americans went to see the brand new movie Crocodile Dundee, which was a comedy that starred this very capable and rugged Australian crocodile hunter who goes to New York City. One of the 35 million Americans who saw this film was a 24-year-old model from Virginia named Ginger Meadows. And after seeing this film, Ginger felt inspired to actually go to Australia to see it for herself because it looked so amazing in this movie. So a couple of months later, in March of 1987, Ginger, by herself, hops on a plane and flies to Perth, which is a major city in Western Australia. And her plan was she would land in Australia and then work odd jobs to make a little bit of cash, and then use that cash to fund her travels all over the country. And then at some point, after she was tired of doing that, she would head back to the United States. So she lands in Perth, and immediately she sees her first opportunity to make some money. There had been this huge sailing competition in the city leading up to the weekend she arrived there, and so she saw all these luxury yachts anchored at all these docks along the coastline, and Ginger's thinking to herself, you know, these huge ships, they have crews that work on them basically full-time. Maybe one of these boats could use an extra set of hands. And so Ginger, who was very friendly and outgoing, she went right down to one of these docks, and she stopped in front of the very first yacht she saw, which was this huge luxury 100-foot yacht, and she introduced herself to the captain of this boat, and she said, "Hey, can I hitch a ride with you guys to the next place you're going, and in exchange, I'll work for you." And as it happened, the captain was actually looking for another crew member to assist their chef. And so he said, "Okay, well, can you cook?" And Ginger said, "Yeah, I'm a great cook." And he said, "Okay, well, you're hired. You can be the chef's assistant." And so Ginger, she climbs on board and she meets the rest of the 5 other crew members, including the chef who she'd be working with. And the chef's name was Jane, and those two would become very close. And then shortly after Ginger had come aboard, the captain cast off their lines and they headed out to sea. Their next stop was going to be New Guinea, which was roughly 14 days of travel away. After about a week at sea, the captain realized they were dangerously low on fresh water, and so he decided to take a detour and turn east and head inland along this river system that would bring them to this large freshwater pool, which he also knew had this huge waterfall that dumped down into it. And so he figured they could go right underneath this waterfall and fill up their jugs with all this fresh water and then head back out and they'd be good. So on the morning of March 29th, the captain anchored the yacht out at sea near the mouth of this river system, and then he lowered the yacht's dinghy, which is a smaller, more agile boat. And once that was in the water, he, Ginger, Jane, and the rest of the crew, they hop in this dinghy along with all these large empty water jugs, and they begin making their way towards this river. And so they're traveling up this river for a little while, and then finally they get to this huge freshwater pool, and right in front of them is this amazing waterfall, and everybody is just totally awestruck by this waterfall. It's like a gem in the middle of nowhere because they're in very rugged Australia at this point. And so the captain, he brings the dinghy right near the base of the waterfall, and one by one they hold up their water jugs and they fill them with fresh water, and then they're about to turn and go back out to sea and get back on their yacht when the captain thinks to himself, you know what, we've been at sea for 7 days straight, it's been very monotonous, maybe it would be a good thing to stick around here for a little bit longer and maybe even hike up to the top of this waterfall and enjoy the view and kind of enjoy the scenery before we head back out to sea. And so he says to his crew, hey, do you guys want to go to the top of this waterfall? And everyone agrees it's a great idea, with the exception of Jane. She did not feel like hiking to the top of this waterfall. She said she would stay down in the dinghy and wait for them. Now, this pool is basically surrounded on all sides by just pure cliff face. There really is no place to land this dinghy. There's no flat surfaces. You basically have cliffs that go directly into water, and then also you have the river that feeds back out to the ocean. So the captain brings the dinghy right up against the cliff face right next to this waterfall, and he and Ginger and the other crew members not named Jane climb out of the dinghy onto this cliff face, and they begin climbing, literally climbing up this wall towards the top of the waterfall. Now, everyone was able to do it except for Ginger. She kept slipping on the rocks. It was very steep. It seemed kind of dangerous. And so at some point, she abandons the idea and goes back down to the dinghy with Jane, and the captain and the rest of the crew, they continue up towards the top. And so as Ginger and Jane are sitting in the dinghy watching the other crew members making their way up, they start feeling a little bit left out, and they're like, you know what? Let's try to find an alternate way up to the top of this waterfall. And so they begin scanning out across this pool at the other cliffs kind of surrounding it, and it looked like on the very other side of the pool, there was a less severe cliff face that maybe they would have an easier time climbing up. And so the two women, they jump into the murky brown water and begin swimming directly across this pool towards this other cliff. And when they make it about a third of the way, Jane suddenly stops, and Ginger notices and turns around and looks at Jane, and she's like, what's going on? And Jane would tell her, you know, something just feels off. This doesn't feel right. Let's go back to the dinghy. Let's just forget about this. But Ginger is like, come on, we're so close. Let's just keep going. It'll be awesome once we get to the top of this waterfall. And so Jane, she's totally hesitant, but she says, okay, fine. And they both continue to swim. And then all of a sudden, they hear their captain, who is now on top of the waterfall, screaming down to them to get out of the water right now. And they notice he is pointing down at the pool in a direction slightly away from where they were. And so they're looking up at him, and they're following his finger down to the part of the pool he's pointing at, and they see there is this tidal wave of water coming towards them. It is a 12-foot-long saltwater crocodile that has noticed them, and it is charging straight at them. Now, Jane and Ginger knew they were too far away from the dinghy to be able to swim to it before this crocodile was going to reach them, and so their next best choice was just to turn and swim towards the nearest cliff face, because again, there is no place to get out of the water. There's only cliffs. And so they swim towards this cliff face, which is right on the edge of the bottom of the waterfall, and so water is landing on them, and they reach the cliff face, and they're trying to climb up and pull themselves out of the water, but there's nowhere to grab onto. It's all totally slick, there's no good handholds, and so all they have is this little ledge that is in the water that they're standing on, but they're still halfway into the water. And so after they struggle for a minute trying to pull themselves out of the water and they realize they can't do it, they both just turn around and they lock arms and they look out through the water that's falling down in front of them into the pool, and they see this crocodile has followed them and it is now stopped right on the other side of the water that's falling down, and it's just staring at them with its mouth wide open. And the two women are looking at it, they don't know what to do, and the captain and the other crew members, they see what's going on, and they're trying to climb down as fast as they possibly can to try to rescue them, but it's going to take several minutes at least before they get down to the dinghy. And so Jane and Ginger, they're totally aware of this, and they're just staring at this crocodile, screaming at it, trying to get it to go away, and at some point, the crocodile does just close its mouth and sink below the surface. But now they don't know where it is, and this causes Ginger to completely panic, and she lets go of Jane's arm and she dives into the water off to the right and attempts to swim away from the crocodile back over to the boat. But Ginger only made it 2 strokes before the crocodile suddenly re-emerged underneath her and grabbed her by the waist and pulled her under the water. Jane is just standing there watching all of this happen in front of her. She has no idea what to do. The crew is still not down in the dinghy, so she's totally stranded, and she's just staring at the area where Ginger has been pulled below the surface. And just seconds after she's been pulled under, the crocodile re-emerges with its head pointed towards Jane, and in its jaws is Ginger. And Ginger's got her arms up over her head, she's wide-eyed, and she's looking right at Jane. And Jane makes eye contact with her, but there's nothing she can do, and she just watched as Ginger again was pulled back under, and this time she did not come up again. Ultimately, Jane would be rescued from the ledge. The crew would get down to the dinghy, they'd swing over, they would pick her up, and then about 2 days later, they would find what was left of Ginger's remains. It would turn out the captain was well aware of the threat the crocodiles posed in this river, and he had told his crew, Ginger and Jane included, about this threat, and that at no point should anyone get in this water. But of course, his warning went unheeded. The next and final story, so our top story of today's list, is called Blackwater. At 11:40 a.m. on December 21st, 2003, 3 young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And, as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m., they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia, and so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park, and at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the top end, and what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two, so it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours, they were out there having a great time. And then at 4:30 p.m., they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck. They drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer. They locked it. And then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the top end, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the top end assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the top end take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the top end. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finnis River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really, the idea that the Finnis River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that, nothing's gonna happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically. But because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finnis River were very steep, if you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finnis River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. We'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up, no big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest, and while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, when Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment, and suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now, all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for, 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into. Because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out. And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? They're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now, the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water, and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot-long saltwater crocodile. He is face down and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water that's holding their friend underwater and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing and he matches his gaze and he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree in that black water is the 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. It's back and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world, and they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these two teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch, he makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy, and then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. So he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs. And finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on. And then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area. And so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other, and then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile. And so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash, they would look down and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree, waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it, and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that killed him. Every year, hundreds of people go missing inside of national parks all over North America. But of those hundreds of people, every year, a few of them go missing under very strange circumstances. And a man named David Politis, who's a former police detective, has made it his mission to look into just the bizarre disappearances that are occurring all over North America in his series that's called Missing 411. So there are thousands of these strange cases inside of Missing 411 that David Politis has poured tens of thousands of hours of research into. And he puts them into books, into documentaries. And so there's really no shortage of strange cases to look at. But as I begin my own research into Missing 411 and learn about these different cases, I have been pulling groups of stories that stand out to me as being particularly interesting or just fascinating or just strange, and I'm making videos to highlight those stories. And so I've already done one video like this where I highlighted 5 stories that I thought were particularly strange. You can find that in the description. I left a link to that video if you want to check that out. And so today I'm going to be looking at another 5 cases from the Missing 411 project that are just totally weird. But before we get into today's stories, if you're interested in the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right channel, because I post 3 to 4 times a week all about the strange, dark, and mysterious. like I'm promising to deliver today. And if that's your deal, I would ask you to please gently uppercut the like button and then also subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of those 3 to 4 weekly uploads. All right, let's get into the story. So this first one really takes the cake for just being strange. You have a family that basically has 2 experiences that are somewhat connected. You're gonna have to be the judge if they're connected or not, but very strange. On October 1st of 2010, this family, who decided to remain anonymous for the missing 411 story, they go camping, and it's a 3.5-year-old boy, his older sister, and then the mom and the dad. And so they go camping at Mount Shasta in California, which is a popular camping site. And the family loved to go camping there. And so they're all sitting around the campfire, kind of hanging out at the campsite. It's getting late in the evening, maybe 5, 6 o'clock. And the sister would say that she was looking at her brother, turned away for a second, and then looked back, and he was gone. And it was so sudden that she actually went to go look for him and couldn't find him. So she went and told her mom and her dad, and they start calling for their son, and they're looking all over their campsite, and he's gone. Authorities show up, and they launch a full search. And for 5 hours, they have hundreds of people scouring this area, not only the campsite, but the surrounding areas, and there's no trace of this boy. 5 hours later, they find him laying in a thicket on a trail that had been searched multiple times. And it wasn't like hidden. The thicket was like right by the side of the trail. So if you've searched this trail, you've found this kid. So meaning he couldn't have been there during the search. He must have arrived and then they found him on this trail. Everybody was so happy that they found this kid and he wasn't physically harmed that no one really looked into the fact that it doesn't make any sense that he is here. How did he get here? Where did he go? Where has he been? No one thought about that. They were like, we got the kid back. We're all happy. The parents are happy. Everyone's ready to just move on. And so the kid goes to the hospital. The doctor looks at the kid and says, you know what, he's fine. This is obviously a traumatic situation, but he's fine. You can take him home. And so the kid goes home with his parents, and pretty quickly the family went back to normal. They were obviously super grateful that they didn't lose their son. About 3 weeks after this whole ordeal, the boy is with his grandmother, who he called Cappy, and he looks at Cappy and he goes, I don't like the other Cappy. And so his grandmother, the real Cappy, she looks at him and she was like, what do you mean? Now, remember, this is a 3.5-year-old boy. Language skills, not the best, okay? But this story that he tells his grandmother, he had previously told his father, but the father had written it off as the ramblings of a 3.5-year-old. It wasn't until the grandmother told the father about the story that he was like, I've heard that story. And so the boy says, while he was camping, he turned and he saw Cappy waving to him to come with him. And so he loves Cappy and he goes with Cappy, and Cappy leads him up a hill to a cave. Now the whole time, the real Cappy, who wasn't there, she was not with them camping. She's thinking, oh my God, someone who looks like me abducted this child. So she's listening, horrified. He said, she brought me up to a cave. And when we got into the cave, he said there were spiders and purses, like women's purses. And he turned to look at Cappy, and he said that her head was glowing. And it was when he realized this is not Cappy. This is the other Cappy. And he said the other Cappy kept asking him questions, but he didn't know the answers. And so the other Cappy got frustrated and told him to leave and pushed him out of the cave. And he said that he left the cave and wound up in the thicket, and that's when he was found. And so when Cappy goes and tells the father, and the father says, I've heard that story, they're like, that's so weird. Do you think there's any truth to this? Is there someone that looked like me, Cappy, that took the boy away? And so as Cappy and the boy's father are talking, Cappy feels compelled to share her own strange story about being on Mount Shasta. Because prior to this, the family, I think the way they were looking at what happened is the boy wandered off and he returned 5 hours later. But with the boy's story being kind of corroborated by, the father who heard the same story, Cappy's like, I got to share my story now because I don't know if it's connected, but I had a very strange experience on Mount Shasta as well a year ago. She went camping a year earlier with her friend, and they go to a campsite on Mount Shasta, the same place where the boy disappeared. and apparently saw the other Cappy. And so Cappy says that night they're sitting around the campfire and it's dark, and she notices a set of eyes in the woods that were glowing. So glowing red eyes, she says. And Cappy and her friend, they go camping all the time. And so they know there could be predators and animals all over the place. And so they grab their flashlights and they shine in the direction of the eyes, and the eyes dart away and they don't think anything of it. Over the course of the night, the eyes would keep showing up all around them. And every time they'd shine a light in their direction, they would vanish. Cappy and her friend are unable to get the light on this thing. So they don't know what it is. And so they're very uneasy about it. But they decide, you know what? We're psyching ourselves out. It's just an animal that's interested in us. And so they go to bed and they sleep in their own. She slept in a tent and he slept in a camper, and they go to bed. And the next morning, Cappy wakes up and she's laying on the dirt outside of her tent. And immediately she has pain in the back of her neck. And so she reaches back and she grabs her neck, and she can feel there's a cut on the back of her neck. She doesn't know what it is, and she looks up and her friend is on the ground outside of his camper face down as well. And so she gets up, she feels horrible, like sick, like violently sick in fact, and she kind of staggers away over to her friend who is laying there, and she can see too that he's got a mark on his neck, and he gets up and he's like, what happened? And they assumed that they had been bitten by, a poisonous spider. That's actually what they believed, because it was a little puncture wound on both of their necks, and that it had caused them to be sick and delirious. They'd wandered out of their camper and their tent, and they'd wound up on the ground. But now, as Cappy is retelling the story, she was like, I don't know how to connect that experience with what happened to the boy, but I can't help but feel like something weird's happening on Mount Shasta. And it would turn out that, maybe they weren't wrong, because Mount Shasta is like a hotspot for missing 411 strange disappearances. And in fact, our next story is another Mount Shasta case. In 1999, Carl Landers was a very experienced hiker, climber, whose passion in life was, on the weekends or any chance he got, was to go hiking and climbing and camping. That was just what he did. He was in great shape. He was enjoying retirement. That was his happy place, is being on a mountain somewhere in California, hiking around. And he had two very close friends that he would go hiking with just about every chance he could. In 1999, in the summer, Carl decides he wants to summit Mount Shasta. And it's something he had attempted to do before, and he had been unsuccessful, and this time he was going to do it. And so Mount Shasta, it's high enough, it's about 14,000 feet, that it's not uncommon for people to stop at this point called Lake Helen, where hikers can adjust to the altitude, because it's certainly possible to get sick from being at altitude if you don't adjust to it, or if your body doesn't respond well to it. And so their plan was get to Lake Helen, camp out for the night, and then summit the next day. So they head up in May of 1999, the three of them. They get to Lake Helen and they set up their camp for the night. It was clear that Carl already had some sort of altitude sickness, because by the time they reach Lake Helen, he's weak, he's sick, and he figures, I'm going to try to sleep it off tonight. I'll see how I feel in the morning. And so all night, Carl is just super sick. It's a horrible night for him. And so early the next morning, Carl is a real stubborn guy, and he really wanted to climb Mount Shasta. He says to his two friends, hey, look, I'm just going to get a head start here. I've been up basically all night. I'm going to just get up the last stretch here, summit this mountain, and then come back down and be done with it. And so his two friends, they didn't like the idea of splitting up, but Carl's an experienced guy. And I mean, he's only covering a distance of maybe 650 feet. Like, this is not some epic distance he's covering. It's basically like a day hike. So Carl leaves on his own. He leaves his backpack at the campsite, and his two friends would watch him as he kind of bent around the mountain and went up towards the summit, and that would be the last time they ever saw him. The two friends would attempt to summit as well about 30 minutes later. One of them apparently had gotten sick overnight and said, look, I can't do this, and he stays at the camp. He's like, I'll be here. We've already split up from Carl. Why don't you also go on your own, summit yourself, and I'll be here. I'll wait for Carl. I'll wait for you. The friend that does make the summit, he goes up. He follows the same trail, this short distance up to the summit, gets to the summit, and he hasn't seen Carl. He's not shocked. It is a little strange that they wouldn't have passed on the way, but he's thinking, anything could have happened. Maybe he sat down somewhere. I don't know what it is. And then comes back down expecting to see Carl back at the campsite. So he gets back to the campsite at Lake Helen, where the other sick friend had not left. He was still there. And he says, hey, has Carl come back? And the friend's like, no, didn't you see him on the way up? Did you lap him? Like, what's he doing up there? And he's like, no, I went up. I didn't see him on the way up. I didn't see him at the summit, and I didn't see him on the way down. And they're thinking to themselves, like, thinking about the trail itself. It's incredibly open. There's almost nowhere to like fall. There's no crevasse. There's no sheer cliff. There's almost no vegetation really to obscure you. It just didn't make any sense that you could vanish. A huge search is launched. They never found anything. There was also 50 to 100 people in the area that day, and nobody knew where he went. No one saw him. No one had any idea what happened to him. They interviewed everybody there. No one knows what happened to Carl. The only clue that we have of Carl is the backpack that he left at Lake Helen before he made the summit run. Other than that, for 20 years, we have no clue what happened to him. None. So this next story is really creepy. One of the strange phenomenons that you get inside of these missing 411 stories is you have people that go missing really suddenly, like as if they were pulled away at high speed and just ripped off the face of the mountain. And this story is one of those stories. In 2010, Eric Lewis was 57 years old. He was an extremely experienced mountain climber, and he had two very close friends that were also very experienced mountain climbers. And they decided that they wanted to go hike Mount Rainier in Washington State, which is a huge mountain. And they were doing a climb that was fairly technical and fairly dangerous, and it required the three of them to be tethered together on the same cable. And so as they're making this ascent of Mount Rainier, you have friend one in the front, friend two in the middle, and then Eric Lewis is the third guy on the line all the way down. And so the way it worked is the first climber, friend number one, if he wanted to rest, the other two climbers would keep climbing up to his position and take a rest with him. So he was kind of in charge of setting the cadence of how quickly they were going to climb this mountain. And so over the course of the day, the first climber would stop periodically, and then the second climber and Eric would make their way up and wait and relax. All day that was happening. And then one time they come to a stop, and there's been nothing weird happening. Nothing's happened to this point. Everything feels very normal. The first guy stops, the second climber gets up to him, and then Eric doesn't show up. And so they pull on the line, and it's very light. And they pull it up, and the rope has been cut. Like, Eric's gone. And they're like, okay, only in an emergency would you cut the line. And so they just start immediately descending because they're like, well, it just snowed. It'll be very easy to track his footsteps. If he cut the line, he must have had a reason. Let's follow his footsteps to wherever he went. But the only footsteps on the mountain were the ones walking up, attached to the rope. Basically, Eric had been walking up, leaving footprints right behind the other two, and then the footprints just stop. There aren't footprints that go back down. It was like he was pulled off of the mountain. And so they start walking down thinking they're going to run into him, but they don't. The weather gets bad enough that they ultimately abandon the hike. They go down and they're like, geez. They tell the authorities and they're looking everywhere and they can't find him. And then they discover this creepy cave that's like 200 feet down and away from where they were hiking. That would have been very hard to get to. Inside of this ice cave is Eric's gear, but no Eric. And they've never found Eric's body. But for that gear to get into the cave, it wasn't just, hanging on the edge. It was inside the cave. But there was no footprints leading to the cave. There was no footprints anywhere. It was just like inexplicably, Eric's gear winds up deep inside an ice cave 200 feet away, and Eric's body was never recovered, and no one has any idea what happened to him. So the last story is actually really two distinct stories, but they together make up a particular phenomenon that occurs inside some of these missing 411 cases, and that's when some creature takes a child and actually protects them. In 1868, a 3-year-old girl vanished abruptly from her father's camp in northern Michigan. The father noticed the girl was gone. In hysterics, he enlists the help of a couple professional hunters that were there with him. They go off looking for this girl, and after a couple of hours of looking, they start to hear what sounds like her voice. And she doesn't sound particularly distraught, but it's definitely a child's voice. And so they kind of cut through this big thicket, and out bursts this massive bear-looking thing that runs away from them. And they didn't shoot it or anything. They just saw this huge animal run away, and they're thinking the worst. because they're hearing this child and now they're seeing this huge animal that looks like a bear running away. And they go through the thicket and they find this girl who's totally unharmed, who was in this kind of clearing within the thicket where clearly this bear creature had been with her. And the father's elated, he scoops up the child and the child seems unhurt, and he asks her, like, where have you been? What happened? And she says, oh, Mr. Wolf took me here. And Mr. Wolf was feeding me berries, and Mr. Wolf was playing with me. Maybe it was a bear or a wolf or something, but some animal had taken her, brought her into a thicket, and had not harmed her. And so the other instance occurred in 1955 when a family that was made up of mother, father, and their 8 kids were staying in this camp in Montana. And they had all these different tents set up for all their kids. And some of the older kids were staying in one of the tents with their 2-year-old sister, Ida Mae, while the parents were working and the kids were doing whatever they were doing. And so these older kids are sitting deep inside the tent, and near the entrance to the tent is where Ida Mae, the 2-year-old, is sitting. And the tent is open, like the flap is open to the tent. And as they're sitting there, the older kids would later say that a bear wandered past, reached in, grabbed Ida Mae, and scooped her up into its arm. Now, a bear does not do this with its arm, but they described it like this. The bear was holding Ida like this and ran away on 3 legs instead of 4. And so the kids are freaked out because they just saw a bear take their 2-year-old away. They're basically hysterical. They sprint up to their mom and dad. They tell them what happened. And the parents just have no idea how to react to this. They obviously get in touch with authorities. They launch the search. And as they're doing the search, police are asking the kids, like, describe to us again what you saw. And they're like, it was a bear that was like holding our sister like this. And they were like, you got to be more descriptive because bears can't do that. Was it a person? Was it a hairy person? And the police just didn't buy that it was a bear. And so 2 days go by and they haven't found this child. And so the family obviously is thinking the worst. They're absolutely grief-stricken. And then one of the searchers finds the girl. And they find her about 300 yards away from the camp. She was inside of a very intentionally built structure. It was like a crudely built fort. Right against the riverbed. And inside it was like a den, and she was in there and she was totally unharmed and she was perfectly fine. And they take her out and they ask her, like, what happened? And she's 2, but she says, Mr. Bear fed me berries. Mr. Bear kept me here. Mr. Bear cuddled me. That's all we have. We don't know what this creature was, what bear is able to pull its arm in like this, but she felt totally unthreatened by it. And to this day, we don't really know if that was a bear or something else, but whatever it was, it didn't harm Ida, and Ida never felt threatened by it. These stories are just a fraction of the literal thousands of strange cases that David Paulides covers in his Missing 411 project. So if you enjoyed this video and you might want to see more content just like this, I would encourage you to gently uppercut the like button and then subscribe to my channel and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my 3 to 4 weekly uploads of content.